In the name of Jesus Christ and on behalf of the Trinity Presbyterian Church, I would like to welcome you to this time of worship. My name is Dan Graham, and I've been asked to present the meditation for this service. When I was a child, I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, and my family and I attended a church that was pretty strict in the way it interpreted the Bible. And they were especially strict about tithes and offerings and the way that the church was able to garner income. And one of the things that they did was specify that we would receive offerings during the worship service. We did not have a Christmas tree lot or a pumpkin patch. We did not do bake sales. We did not do rummage sales. We did not have car washes. We didn't do any of those sorts of things. Rather, we just brought our money in a little paper envelope and we put it in the offering plate each Sunday. That was kind of the way we approached the church finances. And there was a board of church officers who determined how the money would be spent, and that was a neat thing. I remember, too, that we were driving through another part of town, and we went by a church, and I could see through the glass window of that church. It was a full-length door that was glass and a window right beside it, in the entranceway to the educational building of this other church in a different part of town. And we rode by that, and I could look inside, and I saw a soft drink machine in there, a big red refrigerated metal box. And it had the logo of the company there. And I thought to myself, wouldn't it be great to have a soft drink machine at our church? And I mentioned that to my parents, and my dad said, no, son, we don't do that. My mother said, we don't like to buy and sell things at the church. We depend on people's giving of things to the church. Now, several years later, about a dozen years later, we moved to that part of town, and we became members of that church with a soft drink machine, and I found that it was really great to be able to buy a soft drink between Sunday school and church and to enjoy it. And so I thought that was a neat thing. I understand now that in this 21st century, and I think this dates back to the 20th century, there are churches that have large buildings, they have huge physical complexes, and in those churches they have things like a bookstore and a food court, and they even have an ATM. Now, for those of you who are younger, you may not remember ATMs and their prominence, but an ATM is an automatic teller machine, and if you have sufficient funds in your financial institution, you can go to the ATM and you can withdraw money and spend it. ATM. Well, today I'd like to talk about the ATM of stewardship, how we understand stewardship. We've had some excellent Bible verses today. Our passages from Joshua, from Psalms, and from Matthew and 1 Thessalonians are great passages. In Joshua, we learn how the children of Israel worked together, people represented from all the different groups within the children of Israel as they moved towards the promised land, and how they selected folks to help carry the ark into the promised land. And it was a shared labor, a shared project. They did things together. And then in Psalms, we hear about the thanksgiving from 107, about the thanksgiving we offer to God because of all the great things that God has done for us. And in Matthew, we learn about how those of us who serve the church should make sure that we are not ostentatious and that we earn respect rather than demand respect. And in 1 Thessalonians, Paul writes to that church in Thessalonica. Thessalonica, by the way, means victory for Thessala. And anyway, Paul writes to the church there and he says, you know, when I was there and I was with my colleagues, we worked. We showed you what it is to be authentic in ministry. We worked. And you should do the same thing. Well, back to the ATM. A is for ability. We all have certain abilities that we've been given by God. And T is for time. We all have a certain amount of time that God has given us. And then M, I'm sure you're going to say, Dan, that's for money. And yes, maybe so. Well, let's consider some of the other words that begin with the letter M that relate to stewardship. I'd like to start with mode, the ability, the time, the money, and how do we go about stewardship? I have one colleague who laments that being a Presbyterian pastor is like being Robin Hood in medieval time. And some of you may remember, if you're old enough, that I once was in this sanctuary with a bow and arrow during stewardship season and shot an arrow into a target, and it went through the target and hit some of the furniture here in the church. It was exciting and humorous for everybody else. It was terrifying for me. But my colleague that said that we're often like Robin Hood said, it seems like we Presbyterians are trying to take from the rich to give to the poor. Take from the rich and give to the poor. But I don't think that's exactly the way that Presbyterian officers operate, whether they're ruling elders or teaching elders. I think we operate from a cooperative sort of approach to finances in the church. Now, there are ways to get around financing. One is manipulation. We try and manipulate the congregation into giving. I used to work in the insurance industry before I went to seminary, a large corporation. I worked with sales training and that sort of thing, and I remember one of our sales managers told a humorous story about a fellow who was not doing well in his sales. And his manager had said to him, you need to get a gimmick. And the product that they were selling was toothbrushes. That was their product. They had all these toothbrushes. And so this fellow tried going door to door. He tried a roadside stand. He tried all these kinds of things. And finally, he went to the airport. And before he went to the airport, about 24 hours ahead of time, he went to his refrigerator and he took all the leftover food and he put it in a blender and mixed it up. And it made this gooey, smelly mess. And he put that into a bowl and he put some plastic covering over it. And then he got some potato chips and went to the airport, set up a table, had a little sign that read free dip. And he had another bowl with the potato chips and then this concoction from the leftovers in his refrigerator. And people would walk by and they'd see the sign that said free dip. They'd take a potato chip, they'd dip it into that other bowl, and they would eat, and their mouths would turn almost inside out, and they'd say, oh, this is awful. This tastes almost like sewage. And he would say, it is. Would you like to buy a toothbrush? His sales went up astronomically. He led the company in toothbrush sales because he had a gimmick, but he had deceived folks in what he did. There are sometimes promises that folks make concerning stewardship that if you participate in stewardship, your life will be insulated. In fact, you will prosper. That's not always true. I'm going to tell you that's not always true. There are people who say that. There are leaders in churches who say that. They sometimes use different approaches. Sometimes use Malachi 3, 8 through 10 to say that's a contract between you and God, that if you'll bring the tithes into the storehouse, then God will open up heaven and send it all to you, all those blessings. Well, we try and have the right approach. I know that the first church I served in Northeast Georgia in a small community, was then a small community, and basically agricultural and textile folks worked there. I had one farmer in my church, and when he heard that we were going to have stewardship season in the church as part of the program and on the calendar, they had never done that before. Whenever he heard that, he came to me, and he was a big man, and I'm a small man, and he came to me, and he towered over me, and he held out his index finger, and he pointed it toward me. He said, "Don't you dun me from the pulpit, or dun me in private." I didn't even know what done meant. I had to look it up. Apparently, it's trying to collect things from other folks. Well, I didn't do that. Now, some churches will ask you to bring your W-2s and your 1099s, at least photocopies of them, to the church so that they can calculate 10% and anticipate you giving that amount. Thankfully, this church and all the churches I've served have never done that. But there are churches that will do that. Well, that's manipulation. There's also methodology. Methodology. There are different approaches for understanding stewardship and conveying it to the folks who are in a congregation. This congregation is made up of a lot of folks from the silent generation and the boomer generation. And their approach to stewardship is different. And folks from later generations, the millennials, the Generation X folks, those folks have a different approach. The folks from the silent generation and the few folks we have left, like my mother, who's 95 years old, from the GI generation, the greatest generation, those folks from GI generation and the silent generation, you have a program, you have a pledge card, you have a time and talent survey. You fold that up, you complete it, you fold it up, you put it in an envelope, you bring it to the church once a year, usually the first Sunday in November, and stewardship's done for the year. Except each week you make your donation, you make your contribution, you provide your commitment to the church, you do the things that you said you would do, mow the lawn, teach Sunday school, sing in the choir, all those things you said on the time and talent, work at the food, all those things. You do them. But then you have folks from the boomer generation, like I am, we kind of want to know, well, what's in it for me? What's the church going to do for me? And we want to know what all the church is doing, what it's doing all year. And then you have folks from other generations, some of the younger generations, they want to know what specific, I would like to work on a Habitat for Humanity house. I would like to start a Mother's Morning Out at the church building. I would like to do some work with a soup kitchen. Are we doing those things? I'd like to do crop walk. I'd like to do Relay for Life. How is our church doing on those kinds of things? So you see the generational differences, and it's tough to craft, if you like that word, it's tough to craft a stewardship approach that will be comprehensive, especially when you have a multi-generational congregation. There are things that are done that in methodology for stewardship. One is estate planning, where you ask folks to remember the church in their wills and in their estates. I remember a lady named Amelia Huff at the Lakewood Presbyterian Church back in the early 1980s. I was a church officer there at that time, and we found out that Amelia was suffering from a disease that would take her life very soon. And this was in about August. And then in October, she came to the church and she paid her tithe, her pledge, for the rest of that year, all the way through December. And the associate pastor asked her, "Amelia, why are you doing this?" And she said, "Because I don't know if I'll be here, but I want to live up to my commitment." Some people make those commitments and they live up to them, die into them. There are various methods. I knew of a church that paid off its mortgage. In fact, I served one church that paid off its mortgage, but I knew of another sister church in another community, and when the other church paid off its mortgage, they continued to make mortgage payments. They took the same amount of money that they had been paying for their mortgage month after month after month, and they put that in a capital development fund so that the next time they needed a new roof or new plumbing or to add an annex to the building, or to pave the parking lot, they would have sufficient funds for that. You know, there are some folks that think that stewardship should go on year-round, not just on Sunday morning when we make the invitation to the tithes and offerings, but we should all have emphases all year. When our children were small, Rebecca and Ann, when they were small, Judith and I rented for them a movie called The Never-Ending Story. You may remember that movie. It featured a flying dog and little children, animated characters, and actual actors and actresses. And it had music in it that was very moving sort of music. And it had the rock crusher and all. It was an extraordinary movie. Our daughters and their friends liked to watch that movie over and over and over again. And I began to call it the never-ending movie, because it just kept going on and on. Sometimes the congregation can get fatigued from too much bombardment about finances. It seems like we're leaping from crisis to crisis. First we got to fix this, and then we got to fix that, and then we got to hire this person, and then we've got to do this, and then we have to buy this equipment. So it can be tough if it's perpetual. The next word I would say that begins with M that has to do with stewardship is maturation. I was asked recently about some scripture concerning stewardship. And I referred to that passage in Luke where Jesus goes to Jericho and there's a man of small stature who climbs up into a tree. We sing a little song about him all the time. Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he, and how he climbed into the sycamore tree to see what he could see, trying to see Jesus walk by. And so Jesus went there to Jericho, and as he was going along, he looked up and he saw Zacchaeus perched up in the tree, trying to see Jesus walk by. And Jesus spoke to him, said, "Come down, I'm going to your house." Zacchaeus hosted Jesus for a meal. Now, Zacchaeus was a tax collector, and he was a corrupt tax collector. There are many people today who work for the IRS who are fine, upstanding folk, good Christians, good folks who, a variety of faith communities, who do wonderful work. But there are some folks who can be corrupt. And in ancient Roman times, many of the tax collectors skimmed profits off the top. Not so much that they skimmed, it's almost like they dipped the profits out of the taxes, and they charged the people more and more and more. And Zacchaeus had been one of those. But when he met Jesus, he changed. And he promised to give back money to those whom he had defrauded. And he promised to give money to the poor. He was advanced in years. He had a long career of having done the wrong thing, but suddenly he did the right thing because of the influence of Jesus on his life. So it's never too old to start practicing stewardship and generosity. When Judith and I were first married, we were members of the First Presbyterian Church of Jefferson City, Tennessee. The pastor there was Andy Schramm. Andy Schramm was a great runner and a good friend of mine and advised me in my running back in those days when I was in college. And Judith and I went to Andy and we talked to him as stewardship season approached at his congregation. We said, "Andy, we make so little money. Judith's still a student, and I'm working at a minimum wage job, and I'm having to do that sort of thing, and it's not much. And how can we help?" And he said, "Dan, Judith, write IOUs to God and keep them in your top dresser drawer until you're both graduated, until you both have become established in your careers, and then take out those IOUs and pay them to the Lord." And we did that. Now, a lot of folks postpone things. One of my neighbors said to me recently about finances, he says, "You know, Dan, I've been waiting so long for my ship to come in that the docks rotted out from underneath me and I'm in the water." That can happen. But don't postpone. Please don't postpone. If you have to wait, write IOUs. If you have to mature into the opportunity to be a good steward or stewardess, do that. But don't just wait and postpone. The last M word that I would use is motivation. You know, we all do things from mixed motives. Some of us do it from grudging obligation or a force of habit. Some of us do our stewardship just because Mama and Daddy always did it that way. I went to a church growth seminar in Nashville, Tennessee back in the 1990s, and the speaker there said that, the best way to reach people in the church was to have good music. He said, really good music. He told us that music was the key, and a variety of songs, a variety of types of music, a variety of instrumentation. He just thought good music was the best way to reach folks. He said, one other way that I'll tell you, but he said this is all by accident. He was from a large church on the west coast of this country. He said, my church was getting so big, so fast, we had so many people coming to church that I was afraid I wouldn't be able to help them all. And so I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll preach about tithing and giving and stewardship for 6 Sundays in a row and see if I can run some of those people off. He did that. He said, I did it. Powerful sermons, pulpit-pounding sermons. He said, I did that. And you know what? The church grew, and our finances grew, and we were able to hire more staff. We were able to serve all those people. And he said, all because I thought I was going to run people off. But it didn't happen. God had a different plan. Well, tithing, giving, sharing, working for the church will not keep you from bankruptcy. It won't make you wealthy or keep you from getting COVID-19 or getting cancer. It won't keep you from terrible injury if you're in an automobile accident. Tithing and giving and stewardship and sharing will not make you a great sports star or a great celebrity. Giving should come from a motivation of thanksgiving, returning a portion of what God has given to us. God has given us all our time. God has given us all of our ability. God has given us all of our finances and the ability to earn even more. And we return a portion of that to God. I wrote a letter to one of my former college professors. I had not seen him since the 1990s. He had taught me back in the early 70s. I wrote him a letter recently, and I said, how are you doing? And he said, well, Kay, his wife, he said, Kay and I are just neck deep in gratitude. And I thought about that. All of us should probably understand that we're neck deep in gratitude to God. During this time of the year here at Trinity, thanks to the wonderful magic of electronics, I've been able to eavesdrop on what you're doing. I've heard the sincerity in your sermons, in your Bible studies, and your stewardship stories. I think about Dr. Beebe saying we need to pray for change. It's tough to pray for change. If you're not ready to pray for change individually, why don't you pray for the courage to pray for change? I remember Alicia Gardner talking about God's grace and how to let go and let God. Bill and Libby and Brooke sitting around the table talking about the church as family. Not so much that they wanted to control the church, but they felt a sense of belonging to the church. Remember that old movie, Crocodile Dundee? And Crocodile Dundee is talking about the indigenous people in Australia. And he says to the kind of hardened, cynical news reporter, he says, the Aborigines don't believe that the land belongs to them. They believe that they belong to the land. We belong to God and to God's church. I had been in ministry about a year at the Jefferson Presbyterian Church in Northeast Georgia, and I received a package from a fellow named Hal that I had known in Jacksonville. We had worked together in the insurance industry. And Hal was originally from Claxton, Georgia, where all the fruitcakes are baked and sent out all over the world. Hal's dad was a leading attorney in that community. Hal told me that when he was a little boy, he remembered two things about growing up that he would share with me. One was that he and his two brothers and their sister would watch television at night while their parents were away from home, while the children should have been doing their homework. And they always posted a sentry to look out the window, and whenever they saw the headlights come into the long drive coming to their house, that sentry would signal the other siblings to turn off the television, and they would do that. The reason they did it so early, because back in those days, in the 1950s and 1960s, the television screen would go from bright white to a darker hue, and then there would be a white dot that would last for just a few minutes in the middle of the screen. And they wanted that dot to have time to completely disappear before the parents walked into the door to find out if they had been doing their homework. Well, Hal's dad was a shrewd individual. After a couple of times of realizing there hadn't been much studying done, he came in one night when he and his wife had been at an event, and he put his hand on the television and felt that it was still warm, and he knew they had not been doing their homework. Hal also said that on Sunday mornings, his dad would place his wallet and his keys and his comb and his handkerchief on a little table in the foyer of their home. And there at the wallet he could see was a check that had been written to their local Methodist church. And Hal said, I couldn't believe how much money it was. As a child, it seemed like a huge amount to me. He said, but my dad did that every Sunday. Well, when I went into ministry, and Judith and I had been through seminary and we were serving a small church, I got this package from Hal. And in it was a lot of clothing. Hal and I are about the same size. And he sent me suits and blazers and sport coats and silk ties made in Italy, bearing the name of a famous designer, all these things. And he wrote me a note, Dan, I want you to have these things to wear. They're for you. And he knew what size because we were about the same size. And he sent all that to me. The black suit that I used to wear here so often for memorial services was a suit that Hal had given to me. He gave me a wonderful gift. About 2 weeks later, it was the anniversary of my installation at that church. And there were a couple of churches in the community. There was one church that was a Presbyterian church that had been there since the 1800s. And the other one had been there since the 1800s, but the demographics of the two churches were different. One was mainly African American and was on the other side of town by about 1.5 miles, and the other one was mainly European American folks. and they had not been able to reconcile and be able to worship together. But during the time I was there, we did a lot of things together and built some bridges there. And there was a fellow at the other church. His name was Morris. Morris had grown up in Georgia. When I knew him, he was in his 70s. He had seen some rough times. And the day that it was the celebration of my anniversary of 1 year of installed ministry at that particular church there in Jefferson, I was in my study. My study was downstairs in the basement with a little window that looked out on the air conditioning unit and some weeds that faithfully grew there. And Morris came and he knocked on my door. And I invited him in. We sat down and we talked, and he had a brown paper bag. And he gave that to me. He said, "Here, these are for you." And I told him, "Thank you." And I opened up the brown paper bag and pulled out a quart container of blueberries that he had gotten from his blueberry bushes in his yard about 6 miles away, where he had a little place there. 2 different gifts. Both of them precious to me. There are many ways in which your gift to the Lord, whether it's blueberries or fancy clothing, or it's mowing the lawn, or making a financial contribution, or sharing your talent, all those gifts are precious to the Lord. Amen.